Well, good morning, good evening, good everything. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas. Wherever in the world you welcome everybody. And I know the internet gremlins are right here with us again today, but we will just shoo them away as we go along. So forgive us for any internet problems, but we also here have a lot of load shedding happening, and it definitely screws with our internet towers. So all sorts of things. There we go. Anyway, very, very happy to have Kerri Saint back with me again today on the whole series of the forced adoptions and horrors that have been occurring right underneath our very feet over the years. So today we're going to be delving more into Hugh Jackman. You know, Hugh Jackman, the Australian hottie. Who does, who's a great, obviously has this great spiritual, I would call it cover life, because I know, he's very into meditation and always promoting stuff like that. And by the way, just talking about that, on that note, anyone who think, transcendental meditation has been highly infiltrated by the Luciferians. We're actually going to be doing stuff in this early on this year with Andy Bond on that, on the Eastern systems. Oopsie, here I go again. That have been infiltrated, and transcendental meditation has been one of them. You see Tom Hanks, Ellen DeGeneres, and I'm sure actually Hugh Jackman, although I do speak under correction with that, all promoting transcendental meditation. So just be aware, Anyway, Kerri, enough jabbering from me. Over to you. How are you, beautiful? How's the holiday been? I mean, how's it been for you this Christmas? Let's just, I know you guys that are survivors of these horrible situations can sometimes get very triggered over this period. How's it been for you?
Well, for Christmas and birthdays for adoptees, they can tend to be very, very difficult. And
I'm not
it's
sure
been
if this
difficult.
Is me or Kerri.
Yeah, and it's been quite difficult for a number of reasons. I've had someone very close to me fighting a brain cancer, and there's just been some difficulties. So, you don't kind of feel like celebrating around Christmas. And, since the loss of my son 5 years ago, trying to process, going through the grieving process, and every celebration is now a grieving process because you have one member of your family missing. So yeah, I'm fine though. I mean, I'm having more contact with my biological dad. He's moved to retirement or care facility closer to me, which I can get to see him a bit more. So that's been great. But yeah, I'm traveling pretty good otherwise. So it's nice to see your face again. And it was really lovely to have quite a lot of feedback in our last interview that we did, even though we had some difficulties, like the munchkins got into the internet. So a few people asked me about Hugh Jackman and Deborah Furness, and of course they're our Australian counterparts in the adoption series, and in essence, quite big players in Hollywood. And I've never really been a big fan of the Jackmans prior to even finding out information about them. I've never really liked their movies. I've never had a lot to do with them. So I sort of became aware of Deborah Furness some years ago when I was doing the lobbying, when she got Adopt Change up and running to fight against our Australian very strict adoption laws. So she didn't like the fact that Hugh and her couldn't adopt a baby from Australia. So what I'll do is I will start with Hugh. So I've got some notes, and I tell you what, I was a bit surprised about some of the things I found, but then again, we shouldn't be surprised. So I might end up adding throw some things in here that obviously, people don't kind of look at. And when I do some research, I really like to kind of dig, and it's the little things that stand out for me, right? And they make the whole picture. So I'm just going to put in, like Hugh Jackman, his father was an accountant that died in 2022. And it only states his father died of an illness. It doesn't state what he died from, which I felt was a bit weird. His mother was Grace Watson McNeil, and she basically went back to England when Hugh was 8. She abandoned the family, and she took the 2 daughters, because there are 4 children, as 4 other children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and the 2 girls went with the mother back to England. And then later on, the boys went over, and so Hugh was actually left with his dad here in Australia. And he I don't think he found out too much later on why his mum left. He was at odds with his mum for a long time, but she stated she went back to England because of postnatal depression. And even I thought that was a little bit bad. To deal with postnatal depression, you've got to move to the other side of the world when you're living here in Australia. So he went to a lot of private schools, and Dad was really religious. Now, he was converted by Billy Graham. Now, if nobody wants to hear anything bad about Billy Graham, I would suggest put your fingers up to your ears. Now, Fiona Barnett mentions Billy Graham. Did you know Fiona Barnett, our Australian lady who exposed a lot of satanic ritual abuse here in Australia? She actually mentions Billy Graham in that, and it was actually became my awareness that Billy Graham was a Freemason. And that was a bit of an assault on my senses, because I had heard about Billy Graham, and he'd travelled the world and he came out to Australia with these big Christian crusades. So I was quite shocked to find out and see images of him doing the Mason handshake. So if anybody's got anything more on that, please let us know. I'm not saying here is it isn't. I'm just saying that his father's connected to Billy Graham, and Billy Graham has some question marks around him. Okay, so Dad Hugh's dad took him to the meetings, and I found it really interesting that Hugh actually made a quote to a local media, and he was quite enamored by the preachers. And here's an actual quote where he says, "I found something appealing about the itinerant preachers, maybe their power to spellbind a crowd, or their wizardly ability to draw emotions from people, and the invocatory force of their voices." So I was kind of looking at that whole little paragraph and realizing that he never once spoke about Christ and the power of Christ or of God, but he spoke about the impact of the being spellbound by these preachers, and using words like wizardry was quite interesting. He did an interview about his career. He talks about seeing his first movie as a child, and you'll pick up the connections through everything I'm going to divulge through what I found out. So the first movie Jack ever saw was The Wizard of Oz. So Chantelle, have you ever done any digging into the Wizard of Oz movie?
No, but we actually have, we have definitely spoken about doing that as well. So I will definitely, that's why I'm sitting here with a smile. And I just want to say, I'm just letting you talk. So my internet is very intermittent, so I'm not sitting here like I'd love to ask questions, and I have to watch this interview again because I'm missing a lot of what you're saying, just unfortunately with my internet. But I'm going to let you talk, Kerri, and just carry on.
Good.
Oh, my goodness.
It didn't feel so scary being left that time. The first time you ever disappeared on me. I just about had a heart failure. So, you know, I can feel you holding my hand from over where you are on the other side of the world, Chantelle. So I'll keep moving along. And so thank you.
Well, I'd love to hear what is your take on the Wizard of Oz? I'd love to hear what your take.
Personally, I never liked the Wizard of Oz. I've never watched the whole movie. It freaked me out, right? I never let my children watch it, and I could never figure out why until I actually found out how satanic the movie was, or is, I should say. And we can go into it a little bit later on, but I can point people to a website that, and the heading is Luciferian Deception and Wizard of Oz Occult Programming. So basically the guy that wrote the book was an L. Frank Baum, and he was a Luciferian elite, and he basically, the whole thing is a psyop. The whole thing is to do with mind control, MK Ultra, and stuff. So I've actually got some information that goes a little bit that deeper, but I just thought at the end of it, I'll share more about the Wizard of Oz, and then if you want to make it a whole interview somewhere down the track on your channel, please do. All right, so he goes to see the Wizard of Oz, and all he remembers was the monkey scene at the end. He says, I was so terrified that I hid at my father's feet, basically hid behind them, hiding and crying through the whole thing, and completely tortured me, he said. That's what Hugh Jackman said out of his own words about the Wizard of Oz. He added that the Wicked Witch traumatized him so much that he was left with nightmares from the movie, joking that he didn't sleep for 5 years after as a result. It's a miracle I ever went back, to be honest. I probably got PTSD from it. That's what Hugh Jackman says about this movie.
How old was he when you watched it? Was he a kid when he watched it?
He was a child, yes. I don't think he actually states his age, but he was very young because he hid at his father's feet and cried. So what does that say? Now, you've got to think, okay, his father was very religious. His mother had left him. His siblings ended up leaving him. He's sent off to private schools. What private schools is he being sent to? He's being introduced to Billy Graham, right? And then he sat down in front of this movie, The Wizard of Oz, right? When he was about 20 years of age, he was actually studying to become an actor. But at that stage, he kind of wasn't real sure whether that was where he was going to go. And he was working at a gym when he met Annie Semler, the wife of Academy Award-winning Australian cinematographer Dean Semler. She suddenly stopped in front of him, and he says, with a spooky certainty, she looks at him and says, "You're going to be a big star." And apparently he laughs it off, but she says, "Oh, don't worry, it's all going to happen fast. Listen to me, I'm a white witch."
Wow.
So so you're looking at from young age to now he's 20 and he's having a white witch tell him. And Annie Semler and Dean Semler are pretty high, particularly Dean Semler. If anybody wants to look into him and some of the movies he's done, I actually wrote them down. Here we go. Dean Semler, Maleficent, the one with, another witch one, 2012, that was like the end of the world. Bruce Almighty, Apocalypto, which is pretty horrific movie. The Last Witch Hunter, Mad Max Thunderdome. And then you're going to find a connection between a lot of people in the people in Hugh's life, because Dean Semler actually received an Order of Australia medal as well, right? So I'm going to tell you who else got an Order of Australia medal in Hugh's life. All right, so these are some of the movies. And Annie Semler, she did movies Running on Empty and Outback Vampire and Rebel. Like both of them I didn't really know a lot about. And Annie didn't seem to have a huge background, like in her acting, that she did really well. But Dean was a cinematographer. So he was very involved in a whole array of movies and some very dark ones. So basically, this White Witch tells Hugh, you're going to be a big-time actor. So the next day, he landed an agent, and 2 weeks later, he was offered a role in an Aussie soap within 2 weeks. He reckons he didn't take the Aussie soap and dedicated himself to 3 more years of, learning how to be a good actor. So Hugh Jackman himself got a Companion of the Order of Australia for Arts and Poverty in 2019. So apparently he's big on, fighting against poverty around the world. So I don't know who he's actually helped, but we got plenty of people in Australia living in poverty, and I've never heard anyone mention Hugh Jackman's name, but so that's a bit about him. But I thought that was really interesting. He actually does later on have contact with his mum, but because I'm on the forced adoption support organisations, and I hear a lot of information about Hugh Jackman and their influence, especially Deborah Furness. I'd heard that he was very bitter against his mother for leaving him and had a lot of resentment towards her, and perhaps that's played out in his life. So we moved to Deborah Furness. So she was born in 1955 in Perth. Her father's listed as unknown, and her mother, Faye Duncan, is a dedicated charity campaigner in fighting cancer. And guess what? Also another Order of Australia medalist. Wow. It's like they fall off trees around them, I don't know. So she started her acting career in 1975, attending the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City. She's 8 years older than Hugh, and they met on the set of a show called Corelli. It's one where he's in prison, I think. And they married in 1986. She did a movie called Shame that really lifted her career. And in that movie, she's comes across as being gay or is, I can't remember. I did see it. It's really, really old. And she rides a motorbike, plays this really tough woman in it. And it's about a girl that gets raped. She received an Order of Australia to do with adoption in 2022. So his wife gets an Order of Australia as well, Deborah Furness. Recently involved in children abandoned at the border, stating her interest because her daughter has Mexican heritage and her daughter is concerned for these children. So she's kind of been inserting a life in this essence of finding orphans and finding them families. So she says. Okay, that's all I'm going to say to that bit. All right, so they adopted 2 children. They adopted Oscar in 2000 at birth and Ava in 2005. Now, they wanted to adopt from Australia, but they couldn't because of our stringent adoption laws. And they really complained about that. And so they pursued an open adoption over in the States, and they found a mother, Oscar's mum, Amber, who was 28 years old, who'd lost 2 children already because she was homeless and in drugs. But those 2 children went to her sister. And so in 2000, so basically, as far as I know, and I'll go not on my research, but directly from what I was told, is that they really seem to support Amber. And Hugh Jackman even said himself that not only was he adopting her child, but they were adopting her as well. And they introduced what's known, or her, to open adoption. And open adoption basically means that you've got no agency, and it can actually take you down a very nefarious road and leave the mother without any legal representation. And because it's not the same as child custody, nobody has to follow through with the agreement. So the adoptive parents tend to have a great deal of say and a great deal of influence. And you can imagine, like if you're Amber and you've got Hugh Jackman and Deborah Furness, extremely well-off, well-known citizens, you're assuming that they're going to honour the agreement, and you're assuming that your child is going to get the best of the best. And so in an open adoption, the mother and the adoptive parents agree that the mother will have contact. How much contact is negotiable, and it could be exchange of information. It could be even visitations. So we don't know exactly what was around that, but we do know that she was meant to have continued contact. And we do know that so Oscar was born in 2000. By 2006, Oscar's mother commits suicide. So she died a year after speaking out in a magazine where she stated that the only time she sees her son Oscar is when he's photographed in a magazine. So basically, the Jackmans had made sure that they had stopped all contact with Amber and her son. So whatever agreement they had in the beginning, they actually reneged on, and this poor woman died as a result of it. So open adoption exposes the darker side of adoption and its unethical practices. It's a promise of continued contact with the child. It's often used to lure the child and the mother into a false sense of security around contact and involvement. Open adoptions are not legally binding, unlike custody or visitation agreements. The mother is or can be blatantly used as a baby-making machine tossed aside at any time. And this seems the case with the Jackmans as well. After securing Amber to adopt her child to them, it was not long before things went wrong. Hugh even stated that they had adopted the mother as well and that she had stayed in their home. Both were present at the birth of Oscar, and Hugh Jackman cut the umbilical cord, and yet Amber was dead 5 years later. Now, there's a doctor of psychology called Susan Burns who writes a book called Fast Track Adoption, and that's exactly what the Jackmans want. They want fast, uncomplicated adoptions. And so here they are lauding Susan Burns, who's also an adoptive parent, whose own adopted child's mother also committed suicide under a broken agreement. The Furnesses have always advocated for fast-track adoptions, and particularly within the 9-month period, because they believe that a woman is pregnant for 9 months, so that's as long as, basically they should only wait for a child. Now, Hugh was very vocal when he defended Madonna, who wanted to adopt the baby girl Mercy James. He stated he was sickened by the cynics who had applauded an African judge's decision to reject her bid to adopt. So Hugh Jackman comes out and he's really quite vocal, and he's interviewed through that time period that Madonna wanted to adopt this child. And he's basically saying, well, if you're a parent and you want to adopt and there's children needing a home, it's a no-brainer. That's his actual quote. What's the problem? And I'd like 5 minutes with Hugh Jackman to tell him what that problem is. So let me just tell you a little bit about my experience with Ethiopia, and because when I started kind of really lobbying back in 2004, I went to see a senator in my local area to lobby for a Senate inquiry into former forced adoptions. And I remember this very, very clearly because it had such an impact on me. And she had just come back from Ethiopia, and it was her recommendation that adoptions in Australia cease from Ethiopia because of the corruption. I've had other adoptees and adoptive parents also contact me directly about the corruption in Ethiopia, where children had families and extended families and were being put on planes and sent across the world, weren't told they were being adopted. They were just told they were going to get an education, when in fact they were being adopted, and they were the officials and everybody else was lying about the age of the children. And there was a well-known family that adopted 3 girls, and they were all supposed to be quite young age, and one girl ended up being a teenager. And the adopted mum, was only in her early 20s. And this child, once she found out that she'd been adopted, became quite violent, emotionally distressed and traumatized, and demanded to be sent back to Ethiopia. And the adoptive parents were quite confused, and they go, no, but you're an orphan. And she was able to tell them and show them. She had a VHS, this is how old the story is. She had a VHS video of her family where they gave her a big celebration before she left to get on the plane. So these are the stories that come out of Ethiopia, and the corruption and some of the things that people go to. There are a lot more other stories, but Ethiopia was one of the first countries that Australia had decided they were no longer going to take children from, because they'd found out just how corrupt it was. And so we have Hugh Jackman going, well, hang on a minute, Madonna wants to adopt a child. Just because somebody wants to adopt doesn't make them a good person to adopt. And you're not only removing children from their families, their mums and dads and sisters and brothers and cousins and grandparents, you're removing from their entire culture. So now we have their child, Oscar. Now, if anybody wants to go and have a search, they will do images of Oscar with Hugh Jackman and Deborah Furness. Count how many times you actually see that child smiling. And I can tell you, it's pretty minimal. And every photo, you see him with his head down. He's not smiling. He's not making eye contact. In 2018, though, when he turns 18, he actually gets to meet, finally, his biological family. And guess what's the first thing you see him doing? He's smiling, and smiling quite happily. He states, I finally got to meet my biological family. This is what he says on Instagram, right? He says, I finally get to meet my biological family. You are the kindest people I've ever met. And his sister, Olivia, he shares, I feel like I've known you my whole life. Love you forever and always, my little brother. And in this emotional Instagram post, he reveals his pain over losing his grandfather to his mum and never meeting him. His grandfather was interviewed in the National Enquirer in 2016 when he was 78 years old. And he lamented never meeting Oscar as a baby, and said that he would love to meet him before it was too late. He said he was an old man and he was tired. So basically we have the Jackmans being involved in, the loss of Oscar's mum and contributing to her committing suicide, which is very well known here in Australia. And they've been very vocal about adopting children, and they're vocal about it, stating that there's something like 135 million children. It just depends on what day you're asking. You'll get a different answer in adopting orphans all around the world. Now, the problem is that it's what you call legitimate orphans. Children that have parents who are struggling are not legitimate orphans. Orphans are when there's no biological family left for that child to live with. So here they are advocating for orphans, but they didn't go and adopt older children. There are so many children in the States that have been in the system and have been in foster care for a majority of their life. But what do? They go and adopt a fresh newborn baby. and they do it twice. And this is how their whole argument about adopting orphans just is blown out the window. So it's quite interesting that they actually do that and come out here purporting to be loving people who have only got the best interest of the child at heart. So they've come out here and made life quite difficult for people like myself and people who are struggling to keep their children, because in 2012 and 13, we had state and federal apologies for former forced adoptions. We had a massive big inquiry, and the Prime Minister at the time apologised, and then we had the opposition, Tony Abbott, who was the leader of his party. He attended. Now, we had thousands of people at this event, and this man gets up, supposed to be apologising to thousands of victims of forced adoption, and he goes on to say that adoption should be allowable under certain circumstances in the middle of a very traumatic and highly emotive apology. So the whole room erupted. It was a massive big hall. People started yelling at him, and he kept using the word or the terminology birth mother. Now, that was a term the mothers clearly stated they did not want to be said at any level. They hate the word birth mother. Why? Because it demotes them to just being an incubator. They deem themselves as mothers. Like, Chantelle, you call your mum, and other people do. So why should we refer to them as birth mothers? So anyway, so this guy, Tony Abbott, the election comes up very shortly, and this guy, Tony Abbott, and the opposition actually ends up being our Prime Minister. Even though we not long had this huge apology from Australia, and the first thing he does is invite Hugh Jackman and Deborah Furness to Kirribilli House, to Parliament, and state that his government is going to make adoptions easier and faster. And so we not long after that had New South Wales under this, all the money that was basically coming from Deborah Furness's group Adopt Change, lobbying and putting pressure on the New South Wales government. And that's when they started offering adopted non-government agencies $38,000 for every child they procured for adoption. And so the kids in care in New South Wales doubled, the amount of children in care doubled within a 2-year period, because there wasn't the incentive to return kids to families. There was the incentive to get them adopted. So that's the story on Hugh Jackman and his wife, Deborah Furness. And so can you hear me now, Chantelle? I see you have the struggle. Are you able to respond yet? You can hear me, Chantelle? We're having a few problems with the internet. I can hear you. So I was also quite surprised when I looked into Deborah Furness, and she's actually looked into epigenetics. So I don't know if anybody knows anything about it, and I was quite intrigued as to why she would even be interested in it. So if anybody's got any suggestions, I mean, I can surmise as to why she's interested in it. Epigenetics is an emerging area of scientific research that shows how environmental influences children's experiences actually affect the expression of their genes. And during development, the DNA that makes our genes accumulate chemical marks that determine how much or little of the genes is expressed. This collection of chemical marks is known as epigenome, and the different experiences children have rearrange those chemical marks. So anyway, I figure that we're having some technical problems, and I might have to wrap it up there, but I think it'd be important that we go back and have a look at this, and we'll have a look in the Wizard of Oz and find out a little bit more. How you going, Chantelle? You still experiencing problems?
Yeah, and I'm so sorry. And that's why I wanted to say I'd love to rather just wrap this up for now. I want to watch this because I've missed half your interview. You're in and out all the time. And obviously I'd like to question and I'd like to engage in the conversation. And I'm just not able to because of the internet right now. So I'm going to ask you maybe what we take this further on the next conversation. I think our viewers have gotten quite a bit. I know I have. I'd love to watch again, come up with questions and stuff. Guys, I'm sorry, our internet right now in South Africa is just pretty shit all the way around because of the huge amounts of load shedding we're having. And I'm a little bit frustrated that I've got such bad internet today, especially because it's really a conversation I'd like to be engaging in, and it's just too much.
Yes.
Breakage.
Yeah.
So I want to just say thank you so much. I'm going to watch this right now and just catch up with the bits I missed out on. It looks like you frozen now.
Oh. My frozen? That's no good. Oh, what is going on?
My goodness. Okay, guys, we're going to say goodbye. I'm going to call it a day. Kerri, thank you so much. We'll catch up with you again.
Okay,
Sorry about
bye-bye.